The ISR feed floated over the ridge as the drone circled above the valley. Catching the outline of Captain Sarah Mitchell pressed into the dirt with her rifle steady against her shoulder, far below her position. The voices of a SEAL element bled through the radio as they called for help while pinned against the rocks with 2 wounded and little cover left. The wind carried the dust in slow curls around her boots as she studied the ridgeline and listened to the strain in their voices, while the sun edged higher behind the clouds. Every second felt heavier than the last as the pressure of the moment settled on her shoulders. 14 months earlier, she had sat in a quiet panel room while an inter-service board reviewed her application and ultimately declined it after a short discussion about long-term suitability for special operations support. No one insulted her that day, but the weight of doubt had followed her through every assignment since then. The memo sat folded in her footlocker where she had left it, a reminder that she was seen as capable but not quite trusted with the hardest missions. Now, the same doubts echoed in her mind as she watched the valley and braced herself for what had to be done. Captain Sarah Mitchell grew up in the wide open spaces of Wyoming, where her father, a former Marine Scout sniper, taught her how to pay attention to the land long before she ever put on a uniform. She learned to watch the way the grass bent in the wind and how the mountains shifted color with distance. Small lessons that later shaped the way she judged range and terrain. Those early mornings with him were quiet and steady, filled with patient instruction rather than pressure. Over time, she understood that skill came from repetition and humility, not from talent alone. When she joined the Army, she carried that mindset with her, moving through each step of her career with a calm focus that people around her often noticed. She completed Ranger School in one of the early integrated classes and finished the Army Sniper course with scores that placed her near the top without turning her into a legend. Her instructors described her as deliberate, thoughtful, and consistent. She was the kind of soldier who asked questions, took notes, and stayed late if something did not feel right. Her approach to the job never relied on bravado or the need to prove herself. She found confidence in data, in clean fundamentals, and in the quiet drive that kept her improving year after year. People who worked with her saw someone who stayed steady under pressure and made decisions with care. Everything she carried into Afghanistan came from that long path of practice and patience, shaped by the people who taught her and the ground she grew up on. 14 months earlier, Sarah sat in a small conference room at the Inter-Service Review Board, her file resting on the table while a handful of senior officers studied its pages. Commander Robert Hayes, from Naval Special Warfare, spoke with a measured tone as he explained his concerns about long-term sustainment in high-intensity missions, focusing on endurance, rotation cycles, and the narrow margins that special operations forces often face. He did not question her character or skill, and there was no hint of disrespect. Yet the message was clear enough for her to read between the lines. The decision was not personal, but it still carried weight. The board members thanked her for her time and dismissed her with polite professionalism, leaving her to gather her notes in the quiet that followed. She walked out of the room with steady steps, keeping her expression calm while she folded the memo into her pocket. The hallway outside felt colder than the room she had just left, and for a moment she let the disappointment settle in her chest. It was a soft ache, not sharp, but it stayed with her. Later that evening, she placed the memo in her footlocker, tucking it beneath her uniforms where she would not see it often. She told herself it was only one decision in a long career, a closed door that might open again with time. Still, the feeling of being underestimated lingered, not loud enough to shape her actions, but present enough to remind her that she had more to prove. Captain Sarah Mitchell moved with steady purpose as she guided her female engagement team through the narrow paths of the Afghan village. The morning light settling softly across the mud walls and scattered courtyards. Their mission was simple and familiar. A routine cultural liaison meant to build trust with the women who rarely spoke with male soldiers. Sarah carried her M110A1 SDMR slung carefully across her chest, present but not intrusive, ready to provide overwatch if needed. Most days passed without trouble, and she hoped this one would be no different. Inside a shaded compound, she met with a small group of women, while her team supported searches at a nearby checkpoint. offering a presence that eased tension rather than heightened it. The conversations were slow and polite, filled with small gestures and careful translation, the kind of work that required patience more than force. Sarah listened closely, watching faces and body language as much as words. She understood that these quiet interactions often carried more weight than they appeared to on the surface. Just outside the compound, Sergeant Ethan Park waited with his spotting scope, a young soldier with solid training but little real combat experience. He followed her lead with a mix of enthusiasm and caution, checking their perimeter while asking quiet questions about wind and angles whenever she had a moment to teach. Sarah saw potential in him and tried to give gentle guidance without drawing attention. The day felt calm, almost predictable, and she let herself settle into the rhythm of work that had become routine, even though she knew she was capable of much more than the narrow role she had been given. The first shot cracked through the quiet like a whip, hitting before Sarah even registered the sound that followed it. Sergeant Ethan Park fell hard beside her, his spotting scope tipping into the dust as she grabbed his vest and dragged him behind the nearest wall. A second round struck the edge of the doorway, cutting off any doubt that this was deliberate and precise fire. Her pulse jumped, but years of training pushed her into motion before fear could take shape. She checked Ethan's wound with quick hands, knowing immediately that the strike came from distance and from a shooter who understood angles. The round had come in clean and fast, and the follow-up shot confirmed disciplined timing rather than the sloppy rhythm of an inexperienced militia. Sarah pressed her shoulder against the wall and scanned the ridgelines, catching the faint pattern of muzzle flashes spaced across several elevated positions. This was a coordinated cell, likely guided by foreign fighters who had enough training to box in an entire valley. She keyed her radio and reported contact in a low voice, keeping it calm even as she heard Ethan's breathing grow shallow. The reply came from Trident 4, the SEAL element operating farther down the valley, telling her they were pinned with 2 wounded and losing their ability to return fire. Their words carried strain and urgency, each transmission shorter than the last, as they tried to conserve what little ammunition they had left. The situation was unraveling fast, and she knew every second mattered. The safe routine of the morning was gone, replaced by the sharp awareness that the village had become a trap. Sarah steadied herself, pulling her rifle close as she listened to the pattern of shots echoing across the ridges. The shift from peace to chaos was sudden, but her mind settled into the familiar clarity that came with danger, ready to face what had already begun. Sarah pressed her back against the rough wall and let the noise settle long enough for her mind to start sorting through the chaos. She lifted her Leupold Mark V HD and scanned the ridges, counting 4, maybe 5 distinct firing points spread across the slope. The closest sat around 350 meters, while the farthest pushed near 700, each placed with enough separation to make movement in the valley nearly impossible. Their timing and angles told her these shooters understood how to lock down terrain rather than simply harass it. She shifted her scope and watched the vegetation near each position, reading the small flicks of movement in the grass to judge wind. The rangefinder gave her mixed returns through the dust, so she switched to estimating distance with the reticle, matching silhouettes and using known height references. With each target, she ran through quick calculations, adjusting her holds for the M118 LR rounds she carried, thinking through drop, drift, and the subtle push of crosswind that rolled along the ridge. The numbers steadied her more than the cover she crouched behind. She keyed her radio and requested an update on support options, knowing the answer before it came through. Close air support was grounded by a heavy layer of low clouds that blocked the aircraft from dropping into the valley. The quick reaction force had taken contact on the route in and could not break free for several more minutes, maybe longer if the fight expanded. It meant no one else had the angle or the time to relieve the SEALs before their situation collapsed. Sarah let out a slow breath as she settled her rifle into position. She understood the terrain better than anyone else in the valley, and she had the only vantage point with a clear line to the hostile marksman. The weight of that fact did not shake her. It focused her, narrowing the world to the angles, the wind, and the lives depending on what she did next. Sarah knelt beside Ethan and felt for a pulse, even though she already knew the answer. His breathing had stopped moments earlier, and the stillness around him settled into the dust like a final quiet note. She pulled his remaining magazines from his vest, sliding them into her own kit with steady hands that refused to shake. A memory of her father rose in the back of her mind, his voice reminding her that a sniper's job was responsibility, not glory. She pressed her shoulder against the wall and let herself breathe once before shifting her weight forward. The shock of the ambush no longer pulled at her thoughts, and the fear that had flickered in her chest had burned away into focus. Everything in her life had prepared her for moments like this. Not the ceremonies or the tests, but the simple truth of knowing that others would live or die based on her decisions. That understanding grounded her more than any training could. Sarah keyed her radio and spoke clearly, telling the task force that she was taking overwatch for Trident 4. There was no hesitation in her voice, only the calm of someone who had already accepted what needed to be done. As she settled her rifle into position, she felt the shift inside herself. A quiet resolve forming in the space where shock had been. The valley waited for her next move, and she was ready to make it. Sarah eased her rifle onto the broken edge of the wall and let her breathing settle as she scanned the ridge again. The closest shooter revealed himself first with a faint flicker of light near a cluster of rocks. A small reflection that only someone trained to look for it would catch. She matched his position against the reticle in her loopholed Mark V HD and estimated the range at just under 400 meters. Close enough for a clean hold without heavy adjustment. The wind pushed lightly from her left, and she dialed a small correction before pressing the trigger in a slow and steady pull. The round struck close but landed just off center and kicked dust behind him, forcing him to scramble into a narrow cut on the ridge. She corrected her hold by a fraction and fired again, watching the second round drop him as he tried to retreat deeper into cover. Before the echo faded, she shifted her body 2 feet to the right, using the contour of the ground to stay hidden from the other firing lanes. A burst of dirt erupted where she had been seconds earlier, reminding her that the fight was far from over. She swept the ridgeline again and found the next marksman tucked near a line of scrub that bent sharply in the wind. This shooter was farther out, closer to 600 meters, and she used the reticle to refine her estimate when the rangefinder struggled against dust and heat shimmer. Her first shot drifted low because the wind had picked up across the center of the valley. She held higher for the second attempt and felt her shoulder settle into the stock as the round connected. Incoming fire cracked against the outer wall, each impact chipping away small pieces of mud and stone. Sarah stayed low and slid along the wall to a gap that opened onto a shallow dip in the terrain. She used that dip to move 10 yards without exposing herself, then set up behind a pile of collapsed clay bricks that gave her a new angle. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, but her breathing stayed smooth as she worked through the next calculation. The third shooter lay nearly 700 meters out, firing in a wide arc to keep the seals suppressed. She waited for his next muzzle flash and caught a faint shimmer at the edge of a rock shelf. The range and angle made the shot difficult, and her first attempt hit short as the wind shifted again. She adjusted her hold by 0.5 mil and fired, watching through the scope as the figure slumped sideways. A crack of fire from the far right pulled her attention toward the fourth marksman, who sat at a moderate elevation with a clean view of the valley. She rolled behind cover as he fired twice more, then set her rifle on a new rest point and waited for him to expose himself. A voice came through the radio as she worked. Trident 4 reported that they had stabilized one of their wounded and were moving the second behind better protection. Their tone had changed, the urgency replaced by controlled focus, a sign that her overwatch was starting to shift the outcome. Sarah felt a small surge of relief but kept her eyes on the terrain. Knowing the fight was not finished, the fourth shooter reappeared, leaning out to adjust his position, and she took advantage of the brief moment to send a single, well-timed shot that struck cleanly. She scanned again, searching for any sign of a fifth marksman, and caught movement near the top of the ridge. This shooter had better concealment and stayed hidden long enough to force her to wait through several long breaths. When he finally adjusted his rifle, she placed her crosshairs on the narrow silhouette and fired before he could settle. The valley grew quiet except for distant echoes and the steady updates coming from the SEALs as they prepared to move. Sarah stayed in position, scanning each ridge again to confirm the threat had ended. Her body felt heavy from the strain, but her mind stayed sharp as she watched over the team below. The hillside was secure for the moment, and she held her post until she knew they were safe. The last echoes of gunfire faded into the rocks, and Sarah kept her eye pressed to the scope, scanning each ridge for any sign of movement. The SEALs began shifting their wounded toward a shallow fold in the ground, their voices steady as they reported bleeding control and vital signs through short radio updates. She listened closely, keeping her rifle trained on the ridgeline while the weight of the past minutes settled over her like a heavy blanket. The valley felt strangely still, as if the air itself was catching its breath. A call came over the net confirming that a UH-60 medevac was inbound after a brief break in the low clouds. Sarah shifted her position to cover the landing zone, watching the approach route while the helicopter's faint thump grew louder. Dust swirled as it touched down, and the SEALs moved quickly, lifting the casualties aboard with the careful urgency of people who had done it many times before. Sarah kept her rifle steady, checking each high point until the aircraft lifted away. When the sound of the rotor faded, she finally let her shoulders drop. The danger had passed, but the tension clung to her muscles as she scanned the valley one more time. Only then did the full weight of the fight begin to sink in, carried on the quiet that followed the storm. Sarah stepped off the transport truck when she reached the forward operating base, the dust still clinging to her uniform as the noise of generators filled the air. The adrenaline of the fight had faded into a quiet heaviness, and the base felt almost too calm after the chaos of the valley. As she walked toward the operations building, she saw Commander Robert Hayes waiting near the entrance with his hands clasped behind his back. His expression was steady, revealing nothing until she stood in front of him. He spoke plainly, offering a measured acknowledgement of what she had done that day and how her actions had changed the outcome for the SEAL element. There was no dramatic apology and no shift in tone meant to impress her. Only the straightforward respect that comes when results speak louder than opinions. His words carried the weight of someone who had reassessed his concerns and chosen to address her with the professionalism expected in their world. She listened quietly, accepting it not as validation but as recognition earned through a hard and honest fight. A few moments later, the SEALs approached her in a small group, moving with the tired steps of people who had seen too much in a short span of time. One by one, they reached out to thank her, each offering a brief nod or a few soft words before stepping aside. Their team leader stood for a moment longer and told her that they would not be standing there if she had not taken the ridge. There was no ceremony in the way he said it, only the simple truth of someone who understood exactly what had happened on that hillside. Sarah felt the gratitude settle in slowly, not as pride but as a quiet confirmation that she had done what the moment required. The base lights hummed overhead while the evening settled in around them, and she let the stillness of the moment sink in. Recognition in the military rarely came with celebration, and she preferred it this way. 6 weeks after the firefight, Sarah stood at attention on a small parade field while the wind pushed gently across the flagpoles behind her. The crowd was modest, mostly soldiers from the task force and a few staff officers who had followed the after-action reports. Commander Robert Hayes and the SEAL team sat in the front row, their presence quiet but unmistakable. When her name was called, she stepped forward with calm, steady movements that matched the weight of the moment. The citation was read in a clear voice, noting her gallantry and precise counter-sniper support under heavy fire. It described how she maintained overwatch, engaged multiple hostile marksmen, and enabled the safe evacuation of wounded personnel. The words were brief and factual, written in the restrained tone used for combat awards. But she felt each line settle into her chest with its own kind of gravity. When the medal was placed in her hand, she held it lightly, knowing it represented far more than her own actions. As the ceremony ended, she caught sight of the SEALs, offering her small nods before they dispersed into the crowd. Hayes stepped forward to shake her hand, his expression steady and respectful without the need for extra explanation. Their acknowledgement was enough, and she appreciated the quiet way they chose to give it. Recognition in the military often arrived in subtle gestures rather than loud praise. Later that evening, she sat alone at her desk with a blank sheet of paper in front of her. Her thoughts returned to Sergeant Ethan Park, the the young spotter who had stood beside her that morning in the village. She wrote slowly, telling his family that their son had acted with courage and that his presence helped save many lives, even in his final moments. The words were simple and honest, carrying the mix of honor and grief that the medal could never fully express. As she folded the letter, she felt the weight of the day settle in, a reminder that valor and loss often walk the same path. In the weeks that followed the ceremony, Sarah found herself returning often to the quiet moments rather than the loud ones. She thought about the ridge, the wind, and the steady rhythm of her breathing as she worked to protect people she had never met before that day. She never saw her actions as a statement about who should or should not serve in certain roles. She did what she did because protecting others was the right choice, and because responsibility mattered more to her than proving a point. She knew skill came from hours of practice, from listening to mentors, and from the patience to do things the right way, even when no one was watching. The firefight had reminded her that courage looked more like discipline than defiance, and that assumptions about who belongs in hard places often crumble when tested by reality. Capable people come from every background, and what carries them through is the work they put in long before the moment arrives. That truth stayed with her long after the dust settled. One evening she opened her footlocker and pulled out the old rejection memo she had kept tucked beneath her uniforms. She looked at it for a moment before placing it into a small box with other papers she no longer needed to carry. It felt like closing a door quietly rather than slamming it shut. A simple acknowledgement that the chapter had run its course. As she sealed the box, she felt a calm sense of strength settle in. A reminder that perseverance and character hold more power than any doubt that once stood in her way. Thank you for following Sarah Mitchell's story. A story shaped by quiet strength and the kind of courage that grows from steady work rather than loud declarations. If her journey made you think about someone in your own life who keeps going in the face of doubt, consider sharing this with them. Sometimes a story like hers is all someone needs to feel seen or reminded of what they are capable of. And if you want to hear more stories like this, you are welcome to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. As the final moments of her journey settle, imagine the Afghan mountains in the distance slowly fading back into the morning haze. The ridge grows soft, the wind drifts across the rocks, and the valley returns to its quiet rhythm. It is a reminder that even the hardest days eventually give way to calm. And for those who choose to stand steady when everything else begins to fall apart, the world is a little safer because of them.